Good evening, everybody. Welcome to our sixth and final session on the Vietnam War. And see my buddy Tom Hatton there on the screen. So, hi, Tom. I'm going to be talking about from Darrel Whitcomb's book, Moral Imperative, about combat search and rescue in Vietnam. So, it's an amazing book by Darrel, and the details is incredible. And he'll give a presentation to start things off with. And the ROE is you got a question for him, just bring it up during the discussion. So before I get started with Darrel, I'd like to introduce Dick Dowse, Executive Director for the Air Force Historical Foundation. Dick, over to you.
Thanks, Pepe. And thank you all for joining us tonight and for coming along for our talk with Darrel. It's going to be amazing. Darrel's a true soldier scholar or airman scholar, if you want to look at it that way. And it's never too old to go back to college, and he's doing that right now on top of everything else that he does. For those of you who are our regulars, thank you for your continued support. Got a little bad news for everybody. Tonight is Pepe's last book club. He's retiring. And for all those of you who have been with us for the last 2 years, this is the 2-year anniversary of the book club that Pepe started for us. And it's been terrific. And I think all of you would agree. The foundation thanks Pepe and his team who have put this program together. As you all know, both the book club and also the follow-on war stories are available on the website for you to go back and review and anytime you want to. I do want to announce, however, that we are starting our own foundation podcast. And the podcast will be released in early February, and will follow a format much like the war stories. It'll be hosted by our friend Matt Jolly, who does war stories, and you'll get more information on that through notifications when we do post it. It'll be a simple thing to get to and listen. The advantage to the podcast, of course, is you can do it anytime, any place. You can carry it with you, and it'll always be there. So we're looking forward to the release of that. And another new project is the foundation newsletter. It's the first one we've done. We're going to release it Thursday morning, and it's done for the members. It's done for all of you, and there'll be a lot of information that I think you'll enjoy, from little articles to puzzles and information on events. It's just a great newsletter. Eileen Bjorkman, our foundation treasurer, is handling that. The first podcast, by the way, our guest is astronaut Jan Davis, who has published a book about her father, a World War II bomber pilot, and also a shuttle. She was a shuttle astronaut on 3 different trips, and the podcast is going to be terrific. That's about all I have for you now. I hope you enjoy our evening with Pepe and Darrel. Go on, Pepe.
Thanks, Dick. Thanks very much. So you're here now with the author of the great book, Moral Imperative, also wrote back 21. So, Darrel, welcome to the book club, and over to you, sir. And Jen, you got the slides. You there, Darrel? Is Darrel's mic up?
Guys, it's not the first time Darrel Whitcomb's been lost.
He is in. He is just still muted. Darrel, if you want to unmute your mic.
What is that?
Let me text him. I just sent him a text.
You may have to call him.
Sorry about that.
Darrell, it looks like you're unmuted now. Do you want to go ahead and try a comp
Hey,
check?
can you hear me now?
Yep, we can hear you now.
Okay, good. Yeah, I'm really sorry about that. We were on here 20 minutes ago and everything was working perfect. Okay, well, I see a lot of great friends out there tonight and several of you guys that are literally in this story. So you're going to be my check pilots tonight as I go through and tell this story about rescue in 1972. So let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, this is my theme tonight. We call this the Vietnam War, but that's really a misnomer. And for those of us who flew in this conflict, you know very well that it was a conflict that raged across the breadth and depth of Southeast Asia. In fact, if you were to go and read the North Vietnamese histories, and they are very clear about that, they weren't just fighting for South Vietnam. They wanted Laos, they wanted Cambodia, they wanted it all, hegemony the entire region. And for those of us who served over there as airmen, we saw a lot of that theater because we flew it literally on a minute-by-minute basis for the better part of about 11 years. So it was a theater war. And people ask me, what did I do in the Vietnam War? I say, well, when I was in Southeast Asia, I did this in Cambodia, this in South Vietnam, this in North Vietnam, and this in Laos. And so many of us airmen can say it that way. So we're going to focus on 1972. An incredibly violent year in the war when you compare it to others for all the things that happened. And we're going to look at the war through the airman's perspective. There were 3.2 million Americans who served in what we call the Vietnam War. About 18% of them were airmen. And we were scattered around across about 8 major bases in South Vietnam, several minor ones, and 6 major bases also in Thailand. And I might add too, we were not the only quote airmen over there. The Army has a huge aviation branch which supports its ground forces. The Navy, of course, Naval Air supports the naval forces. The Marines, they were all over there too. But if you want to have an air war, you got to call the United States Air Force, and that's what we were doing. My perspective that year, I was a forward air controller, a NAILFAC. Many of you know what that means. I was based in Nakhon Phanom, Thailand, up in northeast Thailand there. We NAILFACs, we flew primarily the Ho Chi Minh Trail. We flew in northern Laos and in Cambodia when they told us to do that. Initially, I flew the OV-10 for about the first 7 months. And then at the break point, I volunteered for the Steve Canyon program. I went up into northern Laos flying O-1s as an O-1 forward air controller doing that. And so I got to see that part of the war very up close and personal. I might add too that when I checked out as a FAC over there, my initial beat was the Ho Chi Minh Trail. There you can see, if you can put the, okay, there we go. Do you see the arrow there? Okay. Right there in Chapone, that was the center of the trail. That's where I checked out, Dirty Rotten Chapone. And then when the East Offensive started that year, my squadron went back into South Vietnam, and we flew with the 20th TAS out of Da Nang and flew all the big battles up around Quang Tri and Khe Sanh and Hue and the A Sha Valley and all that. And then my brother FACs, down south, flew the big battles around Pleiku, and then further down south there, if you can see that, around An Loc. Really, really big fights. So when I was thinking about doing a book about 1972, I had to ask myself, what perspective do I want to look at the war from? And I thought, gosh, for all I did as a forward air controller, that really doesn't cover a lot of the big things we were doing, like the strategic bombing and, of course, the raids that the guys were flying out of the Thai bases up over North Vietnam on a daily basis, and what was going on down in Cambodia and everything. And so I decided that in reality, rescue was such a big thing. All of us knew how to prosecute and execute and participate in rescues. So I would write it from the perspective of theater rescue from our rescue forces. That year, as you'll see, we lost a lot of airplanes, and all of us at one time or another, I think, were involved in some form in some kind of rescue operation. So I decided to do the research for that. And initially that led me to the book, The Rescue Bat-21, which was the biggest rescue of the war. And in getting into that, I realized it was a much, much larger rescue story to tell. And so I decided to do this larger book. So let's go to the next page, please. There we go. Here's the historical context. Now it's 1972. We've been involved in the war now for a better part of 10 plus years. Our nation has made the decision that they want us to come home. So we're pulling our ground forces out. And while we are doing that, we airmen, we provided the top cover for that retreat. And watching out for us were our rescue forces. And they were very significant. They were very mature in the theater. The Air Force, we had the 3rd Air Rescue and Recovery Group with the 37th, 39th, and 40th Squadrons. They had HH-43s, 53s, HC-130s, the Kingbirds. You'd hear them flying around all the time watching out. But we weren't the only rescue game in town. We did have the 37th Squadron at Da Nang, and we had the 40th Rescue Squadron over at NKP. But the United States Navy also had a very robust rescue capability, and they had an outfit called HC-7. And they were out aboard the ships, and they were flying SH-3s and a few still SH-2s. They were a very interesting unit. They were actually home ported in Imperial Beach, California, but all of their airplanes and all of their personnel were aboard the ships of Task Force 77 in the Gulf of Tonkin. Now, interestingly enough, this task force of ships was constantly receiving ships and having ships depart. The ships would leave, go back to Subic Bay, reprovision, rest, R&R, and stuff like that. So these helicopter guys literally had to hopscotch from ship to ship to ship to stay forward on those ships to perform rescue operations. But they were up there up close and personal, and they could get airborne and into at least along the shore of North Vietnam fairly quickly. And they did a lot of rescues for us during the war. Also, the United States Army and the Marine Corps units we had over there, their ground units still had very significant aviation capability. Airlift squadrons, air assault squadrons, CAV squadrons, and these units would very quickly respond to a rescue situation, rescued a lot of guys for us. I might add too, that the United States Navy, when they first went into the Gulf of Tonkin, one of the first, quote, rescue assets that they brought in with them were submarines, because they had learned from the Pacific War back in World War II that submarines could be a pretty good recovery vehicle. And initially they did that in Southeast Asia. Also in Laos, we had a company called Air America. Air America was a contract airline contracted by the State Department to basically provide airlift to the Laotian Air Force. They did not have the skill and the technology to maintain and fly the airplanes. So Air America did that for them. They were all about there in Laos. All of these guys that were flying for Air America were all former military pilots. They were flying in aircraft that were equipped with Air Force compatible tactical radios, and they would and did do rescues for us on a routine basis over there. And of course, we could also call upon our allied forces, South Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. They all had air forces. They would do recoveries for us. So altogether, all of that capability gave us the essence of presence of rescue capability over the breadth and depth of the theater. And we quickly learned that instead of waiting for our Jolly Greens to come from our big bases in Thailand and Vietnam, sometimes the quickest thing to do, the best thing to do, is if you had an asset in the area and the area was conducive threat-wise, get in, get out, pick you up, and get the hell out of Dodge. We also had, of course, special forces that could do those kind of operations for us. We had a very robust command and control structure over there. We had a joint rescue coordination center in Saigon. We had rescue coordination centers initially at Udorn and then over at NKP, and we also had one at Da Nang until that shut down in December. The HC-130s were our kingbirds. They were up flying and orbiting, and they were always on call. And a lot of times when those first beeper calls or emergency calls would come in, they would pick it up and get the rescue going. I might add too that something that's very essential to all of this, and I should have put it on my slide, but for us to have this capability of presence like that, we had to have at least localized air superiority. That's a key issue when you're trying to run rescue operations. You can't have enemy forces, enemy fighters down there mucking around with your task force units, because if they're defending themselves, they're not trying to get their survivors out. So that's a requirement for search and rescue. And back in those days, we didn't use the term CSAR. Everything was search and rescue. We started using the term CSAR at about the 1980 time period when we made some force changes. And over there, of course, to support our rescue operations, we had lots of support forces. Anybody in reality would pitch in to do a search and rescue operation when they occurred. And the A1s, certainly the Sandys, they supported us. They left in November. The A7s came in after them to support on-scene command, escort services. Forward air controllers were, again, all over the theater. A lot of times when a guy would go down, we would be the initial on-scene commanders. We would provide strike command and control. When the A1s or the A7s got there, we'd pass the missions over to them. And there at NKP, we had a whole big rescue wing with a rescue coordination center there, C2. We had intel assets. We had Task Force Alpha, A1s, forward air controllers. Totally a team sport. And we had all those assets ready to go. And that was part of our presence in our rescue capability. Next slide. Okay. So what's going on in 72? Well, the enemy in 72, as the year began, were pushing big time supplies down the Ho Chi Minh Trail in preparation for what was going to be its 3 main attacks that year. The trail was extremely heavy. I see a couple of my buddies on here. John Reimler's on here. Guys like that, they flew those heavy missions when they got their asses hosed day after day after day, trying to bust those trucks. They're bringing the supplies down. They're supporting their Pathet Lao allies in Laos. Big fighting going on in northern Laos and southern Laos, of course, in Cambodia. The mechanized divisions that are coming down from the north are very heavily armed. Mass artillery, AAA. These weren't guerrilla forces. This was modern mechanized army. And then they were protected by SA-2s. They were beginning to put them into Laos, and they would very soon introduce us all to the SA-7 heat-seeking missile, which was a game changer. So for the first 3 months of the year, we were providing theater support to our Allied ground forces in all the different theaters. We had Commando Hunt 7. That was our interdiction campaign, the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And we were doing our thing. And I might add, too, that as we were withdrawing from the war, we were bringing out our heavy ground units, but the Army left behind quite a number of aviation units, and we had these little cavalry units, F Troop of the 8th Cavalry, F Troop of the 4th Cavalry. These little outfits were experts in their areas of operation. They were also perfect rescue squadrons because they had command and control capability, they had attack capability, they had recovery capability, and these guys, they would sit there in their talks monitoring 243.0, the guard frequency. That was the common frequency that we all used for search and rescue. And when they would hear somebody in trouble in their AO, they would run out the door, they would task organize on the way to the helicopters, take off and go up, and they made many of our rescues for us in 1972. So 30 March, the North Vietnamese invade. These are the 3 axes of attacks here that you can see. One through the DMZ, and I might also mention that they were also doing kind of a right hook around it through the Ashau Valley. There, another attack into Kon Tum Pleiku area, and then the big attack down into An Loc. And of course, we forward air controllers were all over every one of these operations, and those were really, really some big battles. Of course, the United States, the president reacted. He sent over, we reinforced, brought in a number of units from the United States, brought in more B-52s, and really plussed up and really started going after these guys. Okay, so let me have the next slide, please. Okay, and again here, just to show you, here's the classic SAR task force. You got your big jolly green up there. Jerry Shipman, I see you're on here. Jerry, you probably flew that tail number there. I can't quite read it, but there's the A1s up there to provide direct support for you. That was our classic task force, and those guys did great service. A lot of times when we'd be running raids into North Vietnam, we'd launch a couple of jollies and at least 2 Sandys, and they would fly up and go into a holding pattern up over the guerrilla's head to reduce their response time into North Vietnam if we needed them to go in. And they'd be right there, and they'd get those emergency calls, and they'd head north and try to conduct the rescue operations. Next slide, please. Okay. So for the first 3 months, as I said, we're doing theater support. We're doing all the things that we normally did. We're putting in airstrikes in support of the Hmong up on the northern Laos, and we're busting trucks on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and we're supporting our guys in Cambodia. And here's 2 representative shoot downs that we had during that time period. In February 17, Sundog 1-2 was an O2 FAC out of Bin Hoa, and he was working with the Cambodge just south of Cambodia. They got hit. The pilot was killed. The observer bailed out. We brought down a 53 from Ubon, and they picked the guy up, displaying our theater-wide rescue capability. I might add, too, that when this SAR started and the emergency calls started on guard frequency 2430, there were Army helicopters in the vicinity of Tay Ninh that tried to respond to recover that guy. The Army guys were over there, and they were ready to do their thing. And then on the 31st of March, we lost a Spectre gunship. The Spectre gunships, the AC-130s, were probably our most effective weapon over and along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and they did tremendous damage to the North Vietnamese. In fact, the North Vietnamese in their histories, they talk about the big black airplane. They call it the Thug. But they brought in more guns, more SAMs and everything, and they finally started knocking some of them down. And in fact, we lost 4 of them in 1972. But this aircraft here, Spectre 2-2, went down on the, I believe it was the night of the 30th. The Jolly Greens got in there and started picking these guys up, recovered 13 of them. 2 of them, though, were a little bit further north, and they were, in fact, picked up by some Air America guys who were in the area. They heard the calls. They came out to help out. So it was a classic search and rescue SAR operation with an assist from Air America, because, again, they were all over Laos. And I think, I see Jerry Shipman is on here. I think, Jerry, did you fly in that mission?
No, Darrell, that's just before I got there.
Oh, okay. Well, this
I
was
was
the one they
involved in
called,
the later one with the night rescue.
yeah, we're going to talk about that one too. But I think this was the one they called the Easter egg hunt.
Yeah,
And,
that was
and one of the big problem they had on this rescue, the aircraft was actually hit by, I think it was 57 millimeter fire. Initially, the aircraft commander ordered bailout, and a couple of guys jumped out, and they actually landed very close to the Ho Chi Minh Trail in a fairly dangerous area. But then he said, "Oh no, we're still flying. Stay with us." So the other 13 guys, they waited. They were heading for Ubon, and then finally decided they needed to get out. So all the other 13 guys got out. Of course, if you can imagine now, every guy has a survival radio. They all got them on. They're all scared shitless and everything. And one of the biggest problems they had that night was getting them organized so they could go in and pick them up. And then we had this one guy there, a young captain by the name of Dale Stovall, He got in there and he snapped up 8 of them before the other helicopters could come in and start working. And so that was the beginning of his tour over there. And you'll be hearing more about him in a few minutes. But again, that's the kind of rescues that we did during that time period. So next slide. Okay, Freedom Train. Starting right after the invasion, General Vought unleashed the Air Force. We started going north again. We actually ran some raids up in the Hanoi area. We did a lot of hits around Vien and in Military Region 1. And we knew that the North Vietnamese were moving the SA-2s down to the south, down into the Khe Sanh Valley. And in fact, that a couple nights after that Spectre gunship went down, we lost another one in Laos to an SA-2. And we got nobody out of that airplane. So this place is getting dangerous real fast. And on the 2nd of April, we had one of our EB-66, this was a reconnaissance model of a 66, was in the Khe Sanh area with a flight of B-52s. He was flying along using their electronic bubble to protect them and try to find the SAM sites. And before they found the SAM sites found EB-66 Bat-21 and blew it out of the sky. We had one survivor out of that airplane, Bat-21 Bravo, the navigator. And he got on the ground and he landed right in the middle of a major North Vietnamese invasion. And it took a hell of a fight to get him out. We lost 2 OV-10s in the process, and we had survivors out of both of those OV-10s, so we had to try to rescue them too. And we sent in well, initially some Army bubbas in the area from F Troop of the 8th Cav, went in there and tried to pick these guys up. They were shot down, they were lost. So the toll was mounting for these dudes as we try to execute these operations. Finally, we sent in, about 5 days into this, we sent Jolly 67 in to pick him up. He gets blown out of the sky, and that's his burning wreckage up there in the top of the photograph. And we realized that, hey, we've got to come up with something new. We tried some other Jollies. They got shot off and sent off and everything. So finally, General Abrams says, no more helicopter rescue attempts. Okay, but he didn't completely close the door. And our folks at the Joint Rescue Coordination Center in Saigon talked to some people over there in what they call the Joint Personnel Recovery Center, which was working for MACSOG. It turned out they had other assets that they could use to get these guys out. We sent in a team under the command of a Marine major by the name of Andy Anderson. His team leader was a Navy SEAL by the name of Tommy Norris, and he and a group of about 6 South Vietnamese commandos went in there and were able to pick up Bat-21 Bravo. And then one of the backseaters nailed 38 Bravo, Mark Clark, and got them out. They were going to go in for the 3rd man, Bruce Walker, Cubby 282 Alpha, but he was killed before they could recover him. But in that entire operation, which took about 18 days to play out, we put in over 800 supporting airstrikes, naval gunfire, and everything. But what that proved to us was that there were places in Southeast Asia where helicopters could not survive. Too many guns, too many bad guys. We had a Navy Cross come out of that mission. Nguyen Van Kiet, the Vietnamese Sea Commando, was key in that. And then, of course, Tommy Norris received the Medal of Honor for that operation. I might add, too, that there's a great myth that has grown up over the years that since Gene Hamilton, Bat-21 Bravo, was in an electronic warfare squadron, that he had to be rescued because he had all the special knowledge about surface-to-air missiles and all that. That's a little overstated, folks. Those helicopter bubbers that went up there that day to get him, they didn't know anything about who he was or what he was. They just knew that he was an American that had been shot down, and they were going to try to go up there and rescue him. So that whole myth about him being special, that's not correct. And there's also a legend out there that the Nail 38, his name is Mark Clark. And somebody decided that he was the grandson of General Mark Clark in World War II, and he had to be rescued. That is incorrect. We went up there and got those guys because in 1972, we knew that we were leaving the war. Nobody wanted to be the last shoot down. Nobody wanted to be the last guy left behind. rescue was a big deal. And like I said before, even though I wasn't a rescue Bubba that year, we were all rescue Bubbas that year. That was the deal. Next slide. Okay, Freedom Train, some more shoot downs. Okay, I mentioned to you that we had a big fight going on down at Anlock. We had to go in there with C-130s and drop supplies to those guys. And in the midst of all of that, these C-130s were greatly in danger. And in fact, we had one of them shot down on the 18th of April doing airdrops there. They were able to put the helicopter on the ground basically in one piece. And some of our good brethren from the United States Army, 29th Aviation Battalion, and F Troop of the 9th Cavalry were right there, picked those guys up lickety-split. Army helicopters provided a quick recovery capability in South Vietnam and were part of that rescue presence. Another key mission that we ran as the battle unfolded up around Dong Ha and Quang Tri there, a bunch of our guys got trapped in the big old citadel that was in the city of Quang Tri. So we used the 53s from the 37th Rescue Squadron to go there to evacuate 149 U.S. and South Vietnamese troops, while the A1s that were up there buzzing around them and the FACs were directing air strikes, and it was one hell of a fight going on to provide for what turned out to be the largest single evacuation of the war, which showed the multi-role capabilities of our rescue units. And then I might point out that the next day, as that battle unfolded, we had an O2, 3 A1s, and 4 Army UH-1s down by SA-7s. All of them were recovered by F Troop of the 4th Cavalry. But we had a new threat in the theater, and that little missile changed the whole game, folks. It was a real problem. Next slide. Okay, then President Nixon decides we're going to go north seriously. So he unleashes linebacker 1, and we're off and running. And I see Tom Hatton's out there. You were part of this, Tony. I see you're on here. You were part of these missions and everything. And of course, as we went north, we started losing airplanes. And one of the most memorable events was the shoot down of Oyster 01 on 10 May. They got in a big air-to-air battle up there, and the flight lead got whacked. Bob Lodge was the flight lead. He chose not to eject from the airplane. His backseater, Roger Locker, did. I might point out that there is an initiative ongoing right now to award Bob Lodge a Medal of Honor for that mission. That nomination has gone forward, and it's the Air Force is looking at as we speak. But Roger Locker evaded for about 23 days, finally came up on the radio, made contact with guys, said, hey, come and get me. And I mentioned before, we would orbit our Jolly Greens and our A1s up there in the Guerrilla's Head, and they were up there that day, and they got the call that this guy was down. The task force under the command of Ron Smith, he was Sandy Lead. He went in there, he led them in there to try to attempt a pickup, and they got run out by the MiGs. The MiGs were up there and they were playing hard. So they pulled out and decided the next day that they would go on and make a max effort. And they called General Vought and said, hey, we need some support tomorrow for this. And he, at that point, said that the one thing that keeps our boys motivated is the certain belief that if they go down, we'll do everything we can to get them out. And that was a clear moral imperative in the flesh. And so the next day, we put together a rescue task force with 100 support aircraft and a bunch of Jolly Greens, and they went up there and they picked up Roger Locker. And Jerry, you were on that mission. You want to say anything about that?
Yeah, Darrell, my first mission as aircraft commander. I was really just following Dale Stovall, and Dale actually made the pickup. I was about a quarter of a mile or less from him when we did. It was, like you say, tell Air Force what we wanted as far as MiG cap and other aircraft, and they gave us everything we wanted.
Yeah, quite a mission there.
Yep.
And there were 2 Air Force crosses. Ron Smith got an Air Force cross for that mission. Dale Stovall, the Jolly Green that picked him up, he got an Air Force cross for that mission.
This is
And
Dale.
then
Can you hear me?
what's that?
This is Dale Stovall.
Oh, Dale, you're on. Okay, you got the mic, buddy.
It's under Carol Stovall's name. Anyway, yeah, that that Ron Smith is the reason that Roger Locker was rescued. It's just plain and simple. If he hadn't been there those 2 days, if anything had happened to him, it would not have occurred, period. And, we were kind of like the early Uber drivers. We knew we had a customer. We're not quite sure who he was, and he was in a bad neighborhood. We needed those A1s, and they were the key to the success.
Team sport all the way. Okay. And then speaking of Dale Stovall, a few weeks later, we have another big air battle take place, and MiGs came up, and on that particular day, 27 June, had a big air battle. 4 F4 shot down that day, 3 to MiGs and 1 to an SA-2. We sent up the Jolly Greens to make a recovery effort for one of the aircraft, a Valiant 04, and I think Tom Hatton's on here. He was in the backseat of that aircraft, but Tom, as I recall, we didn't get there quick enough for you.
No, you guys didn't. I heard the air battle. You guys were on the other side of that karst when you were hosing down. I don't know, those guys were shooting at you and you were shooting back. I had already been scarfed up after about an hour running through the jungle. There was no place. I was right next to a village and near a rice paddy. But they took me up into that karst area and all afternoon listened to you guys rescue my front seater.
Yeah, and as the day played out, his pilot Lynn Aikman was down on the ground, and we had and there were other guys on the ground too. We had another pick that took place, and then we needed another Jolly Green, and back at the squadron, they decided to launch Jolly Green 6-7, and it was a pickup crew, and Dale Stovall was the first pilot to the desk that said, "I'll take that mission." They launched up there on the wing of Jolly 7-3, and Jolly 7-3 was the low bird. He went in and attempted to make a pickup, put his PJ on the ground because the pilot was pretty badly wounded. And in fact, I think Chuck McGrath, are you on here tonight too?
Yes, sir.
There he is. There's our PJ right there. That was that crazy dude went down on the penetrator to pick up Valiant 04 Alpha. And when he got on the ground down there, the bad guys in the area had been taught swarm tactics, and they were swarming into that valley, and everybody was taking pot shots at the helicopters, and Jolly Green 73 got pretty badly damaged, shot at his hydraulic system, and they had to jettison their hoist system, which meant that Chuck and the pilot were on the ground, and the only ride left in town was Jolly Green 5-7, commanded by Dale Stovall. And he assessed the situation and made the call, "We're going in." And they went in there and they picked up those 2 guys, and I'm proud to say that Dale, because of that action, has been nominated now for a Medal of Honor. Yeah. Dale, you want to say something? Oh, can't hear you.
Dale, you're still muted. I'm mute.
Unmute. Dale, unmute.
Dale, unmute.
Okay, I'm unmuted. Okay.
Okay.
It was another one of these things where we were in the hover, the A1s were there strafing. They saved us. Both of us probably could have been easily shot down if it hadn't been for the A1s again. And it was one of those things. It was getting late in the afternoon, and I knew those 2 guys were really going to be captured or probably killed, because we killed a lot of people trying to get them out before that time. And it was a little bit of a gut check.
Chuck, what did it look like from the ground down there?
Um, it's hard to describe. It's just, the noise level. My roommate was on the ramp, told me later he was dropping empty shell casings down on top of me, trying to get my attention to tell me that there were some bad guys coming down the trail about 40 yards away. Yeah, if it hadn't been for Dale, I've been coming back with Tom Head.
On that mission, as I recall, Jolly 6-7 took, or I'm sorry, Jolly 7-3 took several dozen hits. Jolly 5-7 itself took at least a dozen or so hits, a couple of dozen or so hits. Jolly 7-3 had one guy wounded on board. In Jolly 5-7 had two guys wounded on board as this battle was going on, and all the gunners were blazing away and everything. And interestingly enough, now the helicopter that Dale flew that day is sitting in the Air Force Museum, Jolly Green 5-7. So there's quite a story there. Next slide.
Well,
What?
yours
Let me
was
add a couple things
interesting.
to that. I got to walk through that village that was burning after you guys did all the strafing. And Tony Marshall, who was also on this, he and his front seater, Marty Cavato, watched us get shot down, and they were unable to get the nose out of F4 pointed at the MiG-21 to hose them before we got hammered.
Yeah, that's right. Tony, are you on here?
Yeah, I'm on here.
Do you remember that day?
Oh, yeah.
Tell us about it.
Well, we were in looking for Bill Beekman, and we had gone in, come back out and refueled. And Buffalo Chip decided to saddle us with an escort, which we didn't want, but Tom and his crew escorted us in. And as we were coming back out, they said they had a MiG at 20 miles at 6 o'clock, which we didn't think anything about. And that there were two more at 2 o'clock coming back, running out of gas. And as we were turning to intercept the two coming back, Marty took over the check 6 and he saw the two fireballs back there. And like I say, we pulled up, did an Emmelman. We got a lock on the MiG, but of course the missile never came off the rails. So that was the end of that. So again, we took the coordinates and beat feet out of there.
Interestingly enough, now I've read the North Vietnamese histories of that air battle, and they knew what our rescue tactics were, and they knew that as soon as they bagged some of our airplanes, we'd be sending in our recovery aircraft. So that on that particular day, the air commander up there, the North Vietnamese air commander, had ordered his pilots to shoot down the rescue aircraft. So that's what was going on above the helicopters when they were in there trying to do their thing. It was quite an eventful day in literally in the Vietnam War, and especially during linebacker and everything. So
One last comment, I got to meet the MiG pilot who shot me down.
you still in touch with him? You Christmas cards, what?
No, not quite that well, but I've seen him on three occasions. One time when about 20 of the North Vietnamese pilots visited a bunch of Navy guys down in San Diego. And then I was over there. They invited a bunch of us back, hosted us, and I taught them how to do deceased insect, which I've got some great
good for
photos
you.
of.
Yeah.
And then I was over there on another cruise last year and happened to stop by Hanoi and saw them. They were just like we are. They're fighter pilots. They were doing their job. They actually love Americans, and they like Scotch.
Imagine that. Okay. We're going to jump over to linebacker 2 now. Now, linebacker 2, the story is very different because now we're doing the bombing up around Hanoi, and I showed you at the bottom here in November, we the A1s went away, and we got A7s in to be our Sandy aircraft. Very, very different aircraft. Very, very different challenges. The pilots were crackerjack guys. Hard charging, wanted to do a fine job, but they had a very different airplane. The airplane had inertial nav system in it. It had moving map displays, and it needed to stay above about 400 knots to stay in the air. And so all of a sudden, the Jolly Green guys, now they're used to seeing an A1 off of each wing, and now the best they can do is occasional visual contact as some A7 sweeping by them. And they really had to modify their tactics. But we had some significant rescues occur during this time period. One in particular, we lost another AC-130, again, over the Ho Chi Minh Trail, down south, Spectre 17. This was at night. And the A7s went in there, did their thing. By this time, we had several of our helicopters that were modified with a limited night recovery system that was kind of a rudimentary system. And we had our first successful recovery that night. And in using that system, it reinforced for us the value of using the darkness to protect our recovery forces. Because quite honestly, the gunners just can't see at night. And more than anything else, it's the guns that kill you, not the SAMs. And so this was a step forward. This became one of the precursors, literally, to what later on became the Pavlo system and that whole community of helicopter guys. But Jerry Shipman was flying that night. He flew Jolly Green 3-2, and I'm going to call upon him to tell us about that mission, Jerry. There you go.
Darrel, like I say, we were on NRS alert, and we took off out of NKP, heading south east down into the Bolivans. And as we were getting close to the area, we did take some AAA fire. Then we, at that point, turned off our lights, and I had my wingman go into orbit, and I went on, and I could wreckage of the C-130, and we had a C-130 in the area, AC-130, who was actually giving me directions to where the two survivors were on the ground. And we had, on that aircraft, we used night vision or low light level TVs, and our pararescue guys wore night vision goggles. Anyway, we got into the area and picked up the strobe light of the first survivor, and I put a PJ on the ground, and that went pretty good. There's one big tree in the area which was giving our hover coupler a bit of a problem, but we got the first survivor on board in the PJ, and then we were vectored towards the second survivor, and all this was being taped, the video, by the AC-130 overhead with his infrared system. But I got over to the second survivor, and he was in fairly deep jungle. I put down one PJ, and when he got on the ground, he found that there's vines about 10 foot thick that he was trying to get through and get over to the survivor. And it took him a little while to get there. But they both got back on the forest penetrator, the survivor and the PJ, and we started bringing them up. And about that time, our hover coupler and Doppler system picked up trees moving, and all of a sudden we go hard over, and I'm dragging the PJ and the survivor through the trees. Luckily, the only thing we lost was a pair of night vision goggles, but we got the survivors on board. We searched for another, I think there was about another 12 people on board, but we couldn't find any more survivors, and we departed the area. And I joined up again with my wingman, and I turned my lights on so he could find us, and we took AAA again, turned the lights off, and separated and went on back to NKP. But it did prove that if you could go in there and stay blacked out, even the guys on the ground could not really see where the helicopter was. They could hear it, but they couldn't really see it. So it showed a good capability, which later led to the Pablo, as you said.
Oh, great story. Thank you so much for
Yep.
sharing that, Jerry. Great stuff. Okay. And you can see my note on here.
This is Dale. I got a comment. They
Okay.
flew Jerry all the way back to the Corona conference for all the 4-star generals to brief that mission.
Jerry, tell us about it.
Well, yeah, I got a call one day. I'm in the squadron there at NKP, and I get a call from our squadron commander, and he says, "Hey, Jerry, how would you like to go back to the States?" And I said, "Well, I'd love to go back to the States." And he says, "How long will it take you to get ready?" And I said, "Well, give me an hour." He says, "You got 30 minutes. There's a 1:30 on short final to pick you up." And I got flown back by the 1:30 and then picked up by 141s and taken all the way back to Scott Air Force Base. All the way back, the only thing I could knew was I was carrying a video film, 16 millimeter of the mission, and I was met when I landed at Scott by another H-53 guy, Bob Paul, and he told me, "Well, we got time to get to lunch." And that's brief. And we ended up going to lunch, snow about a foot deep, and I just came from NKP and anything else. But anyway, we got in, briefed the director of operations that it's okay, and then we briefed Speedy Pete Everest rescue, and after that briefing, they said, "Let's," and that was rescue our MAC headquarters, and priest generals there. And after that, I was told, "We're going to take you down south in Puerto Rico to the Air Force Conference Center to brief the 4-star PK Carlton." And I thought, well, I had briefed him earlier, a couple of weeks ago. But we get down there, and truly, I still had no script as to what I was going to say. But we get down there, and right after we landed, we went over to the conference center to check it out. And first person that came in was the 4-star PK Carlton. And we started briefing him. And about that time, another guy walked in fishing clothes, and that was Secretary Seaman, Secretary of the Air Force. And so we started over, and we gave him a bit of briefing, and he said, "That's fine." He says, "We'll do it tomorrow." And the next day, it looked like the Milky Way out there for me, a young captain, still without a script, briefing that mission. And all the 4-stars and the Secretary of the Air Force were around the table, and the 3 of 2-stars were in the back of the room. But it went pretty well, and I think that's part of the reason we ended up with the Pablo.
How about that? That's a great story, Jerry. Thank you so much. Yeah,
Very
the Pablos,
unexpected one.
the Pablos we flew them until 2008, when the Army insisted that they be activated so they could have the mission, be deactivated so they could have that mission, and that's a fact.
Yep.
Okay, back to linebacker 2. Now, there's not a lot of stories to tell because there were no rescues in the Hanoi area during linebacker 2. There was one attempt, very significant attempt. Jackal 3-3 was an F-111. I don't have a slide up here for them. But anyway, they were shot down on the 22nd. They were south of Hanoi. Of course, they jettisoned out in the capsule. Within about a day or so, the pilot Sponnyberger was captured, but Bill Wilson, his pilot Wizzo, was evading. We knew about where he was. The A7s were working with him as they could, but he's only about 25 miles from Hanoi, up there by that red pointer up there. And finally, after several days and a couple of attempts, we did get a Jolly Green in to them. The Jolly Green got into a hover over Bill Wilson. As it was lowering the penetrator, there were bad guys all around. They were swarming the aircraft, firing away at it. The aircraft was taking hits. The aircraft commander, Rick Shapiro, was holding the hover, and Bill reached up to grab the penetrator, and we don't know what happened, but somehow he slipped or fell, or maybe it was the static shock of the penetrator, who knows. Anyway, he slid down the side of the mountain. They did not pick him up. And by this time, the helicopter had been badly shot up. The co-pilot was wounded. He was bleeding like a stuck pig. So Rick Shapiro pulls out, tries to refuel, has a nice clean 51 millimeter bullet hole right through his refueling probe. He can't take gas, so he has to put the helicopter down up on the Laotian border. The High Jolly comes in and picks him up. It was a non-rescue. We got as close to them as we could, but it was a situation where we just couldn't pull it off. Interestingly enough, I am told that Shapiro died a few years ago, and I'm told that one of his final thoughts was his regrets that he wasn't able to pull off that rescue. So sometimes these missions stay with you a long time. But one mission I do like to talk about is...
Wait, hey, Jerry Shipman was the person that picked him up.
Oh, Jerry was on that mission too, huh?
Yes.
Okay, Jerry, you want to tell us about that one?
Yes, I was on that mission. Actually, what we did, I was in the second element. When Rick came out, I'm the one that talked him into trying to refuel without extending his he couldn't get that out, but then he plugged in, as you said, and all the fuel came out the side of the refueling probe. And so I actually told Rick there was a clearing area up not too far in front of us, and but I had watched North Vietnamese trucks coming through all morning, and when Rick went in to get them, and they picked up Rick, and as they were leaving out, my wingman was going to the crew was going to strip the helicopter of the men classified, but they started, there's I think some barracks just over the hillside, and we were starting to take ground fire from the barracks area. And anyway, I ended up our miniguns. We basically were a gunship, and allowed the other crew to get back on their helicopter and come out of there. But we had the helicopter on the ground, and it was going to be taken by the North Vietnamese. I called 7th Air Force and asked if the forces in the area that could secure it and the helicopter, and they said no. And about that time, the A7 showed up, and I said, well, I recommend that we destroy the helicopters, which we did. And but we got everybody out, but we lost a very valuable H-53 because it had all the newest components on it.
Oh, okay. So tell me, Jerry, what does Hanoi look like from the window of a helicopter?
So it's a bit of a frightening sight, and I think Dale could attest to that too, because we did see it. And Hanoi by helicopter was intimidating.
One story I do like to share about linebacker 2 is the story of Scarlet 03 and Pete Camarota. He was the bomb nav on that when they were shot down that night. He jettisoned out, got on the ground, and evaded for several days before we finally realized that he was in there. And then after the ceasefire was initiated on the 28th, we were not allowed to make any more rescue operations. And so Pete basically evaded until finally he realized that he needed to surrender to live. And I asked him, I said, what made you realize that you needed to surrender? And he said, well, quite honestly, he said, I tried to urinate and what little came out was black and I realized I was dying. So he was up on top of a knoll that was surrounded by paddies, and they were Vietnamese out there in the field with some militia folks farming and everything. And so he tried to shout, and he was so weak that he could not make any sound. So he took out his pen gun flare, and he did not have enough strength to pull back with his thumb on the pen gun flare. So he was able to kind of jury rig it on his boot and get one of those flares to fire, and it popped up. And then the people all saw him. And I said, well, what happened then? He says, well, then they all started shooting at me. So he just kind of laid down on the ground, and they came up on the hill and captured him, and then took him onto Hanoi and threw him in the slammer with Tony and Tom and you guys did. Yeah, and he was one of the last guys taken. In fact, after the termination of linebacker 2 operations, we were pretty positive, according to the records, that we had 3 survivors on the ground up in the Hanoi area, but we had no authority to try to go in there and get them. And so, like I say, there were no rescues in the Hanoi area doing linebacker 2. And again, it has to do with the fact that there's places where our rescue forces just can't go. It's just too dangerous. Next slide. Okay, so let's look at some numbers. I'll throw some here. You can see I ran these numbers. Basically, I used Chris Hobson's book. There's a lot of different sets of numbers I could use, but I thought Hobson's was the most inclusive. So you can see, first of all, what our losses were, and then the results, the numbers of POWs that we had. Our overall rescues were running at about 38%. So about 2 out of 5 we're getting. And then you can see there a list of the various recovery vehicles, if you will, that we had, the Air America guys, the Navy helicopters, Navy ships picked up a lot of guys for us out in the Gulf. You know, we told our guys, if you can get feet wet, that's your best shot. And the Navy was out there. And then for helicopter losses, now I'm talking rescue helicopters here. You can see we actually lost an H3 down in the Anlock area, and then 4 of the 53s. And then there were a lot of awards given that year for recovery. 3 Medals of Honor, all for recovery type actions, which actually took place, most of them just east of Quang Tri, as it turned out. Service crosses, you can see roughly about 1/3 of each of those that were given out that year for the various services were given out for rescue efforts. And then down at the bottom, rescue personnel received 17,000 individual awards during the war. That's a lot of stuff. There's some other tactical lessons learned. Next slide, please. Okay. 3rd Air Rescue Recovery Group Commanders EOT items. Really like the A7. New technology, but also some limitations. And we found out that we really had to re-scramble our rescue forces to make it work with the A7s. As an example, the A7s don't carry as much ordnance as did the A1s. And so we would fly them as 3 ships instead of 2 ships. And of course, they were air refuelable, and they needed to do that to have any kind of loiter time at all, and so we had to bring in more tankers into the theater to support that. We realized that we needed to have a more quickly available way to locate our survivors. And over the years, we've developed some very sophisticated radios now to give us that capability. And as Jerry alluded to, the performance at night, the use of NVGs should be exploited because we have advantages at the night. We found out that our AC-130s could be excellent on-scene commanders, especially low environment night situation like that. And that we needed a better, smaller, faster helicopter which could survive in a high threat environment. And you can see the comment here. Some of those areas were just too dangerous. Support for electronic warfare items that we then subsequently put on the helicopters. The Pavlos saw a lot of that. And then again, I talk about the totality of rescue assets available gave us that ubiquitous presence throughout the theater, which gave us the ability to have assets very quickly available. And we saved a lot of guys because of that. And then another thing, all of our tactical aircraft had UHF radios. They all had 243 guard receivers on them. I don't know who thought about doing that, but that was a real lifesaver because that was the lifeline in many cases that facilitated rescues. And I'm talking about guys coming out of North Vietnam with their hair on fire and holes in the wing and everything else, scared shitless, and they come up on guard and say, I'm about to bail out. I think I'm just south of the DMZ. And the first guy that would hear that call would probably be an Army Bubba in a Loach down below who sees that call, calls his wingman and says, we're going to go pick this guy up. But we did a lot of rescues that way. Thank the United States Army. And thank whomever designed the idea of having a 243.0 Hawks receiver in there. So, next slide. I'll give you my bottom line. These things we do, emphasis on the we. Rescue was a team sport. And we have with us tonight several guys who were part of that team. These guys are real heroes. But you had to remember that the moral imperative, as important as it is, those airplanes operate according to the immutable laws of physics, and no amount of moral imperative can override those and violate their limits. There were just places where helicopters could not go in the violent skies of Southeast Asia in 1972, and that's a fact. And I know in speaking with the young men and women who fly this mission today, they understand this imperative. They are prepared to go. They are, no, I won't say eager, but they are trained and equipped and ready to go when we need them, but we have to be smart enough to know when and when not to send them. That's a big, tough call, and that's something that our commanders have got to do. And then another perspective that I throw out there, I think this is very unique. I honestly believe that in looking at all this data that I looked at to write this book, that ultimately Linebacker 2 itself was the ultimate was the ultimate SAR mission of the war, because the only thing that we really got out of our old guy, out of that war, was we got our 591 POWs back, and a couple of them are on here with us tonight. Tom, it's my understanding, Tony, I asked you this too, that when you guys heard the bomb starting to fall, you knew that pretty soon you'd be getting a ride home. Is that true?
We didn't know. I didn't know how soon it was going to be, but I knew that Nixon was serious about getting their attention. And I'll tell you that did get their attention. I could tell you stories what the guards were like the next morning after that first night. They were their eyes were as big as plates. They were not happy campers.
Tony, how about you? What do you remember?
I figured the war would be over by Christmas before I got shot down, just the way we were conducting it. But amazingly, the B-52s convinced them that, it's nice to sit back and direct the war like the folks in Washington did, but when the bombs start hitting home to you, it gets your attention. So like Tom said, it made a tremendous impact on the folks that were prosecuting that war from Hanoi.
Okay, so this has been a quick review of what I've put in my book. Again, I wanted to tell the story of 1972. from the perspective of rescue, because that was common to all of us over there. And I like to point out to the young men and women when I talk to them I'm talking to you with some old tactics. There may be new tactics, but there's never any old tactics. And there's things here, you put them in your kid and you don't know what's going to happen in the future. Something that we've presented here could be useful to you. And that's the whole idea. And I just want to remind everybody that fighter pilots have heroes too. They're called Jolly Greens. And at the end of the runway there, Nakam Phanam, Dale gave me this picture. That was the alert shack there. And when we would taxi out and take off, every time I took off on the OB-10, I'd see that sign there, and I knew exactly what that meant. God bless them all. So, next slide. That's my story, folks, and I'm sticking to it. And I've got a couple witnesses here and a few alibis, and it's all good.
Hey, thanks, Joe. That was pretty awesome. We have a few questions. I'll let Jen, Mel jump in and get the questions going. You there, Mel?
I sure am. Actually, I'm going to send it over to Mr. Binder if you want to ask your question. Otherwise, I'm happy to read it for you.
Okay. OA-10, derived from the A-10, designed as a tank killer for use in Europe. How would it have fared in the search and rescue in Southeast Asia?
Oh, the A-10? Oh my God.
Yeah.
Well, an A-10 is basically nothing but a jet-powered A-1. I flew the A-10, and I see Bill Riles on there too. Bill, I'm going to lateral this question over to Bill Ryle, because in his A-10 days, he was Mr. A-10 CSAR guy. So, Bill, do you think that the A-10s can handle the CSAR mission? Got to unmute.
Thanks a lot, Darrell. Absolutely. And for everybody, I was a Cold War killer. I was a Jolly guy during the Cold War and an A-10 Sandy guy during the Cold War. And as I wore Darrell out in an email telling him about my CSAR peacetime training, I will tell you the same thing I tell people that ask me how we would have survived in the A-10 during the full gap little combat scenario that folks were planning. All I wish is that we could go back in time, and as much as I thought the A-7 was very, very capable, I think that the A-10, as Darrell alluded to earlier, it was so close to being able to do what the A-1 could do and stay there longer than the A-7 could stay there. I think it would have been a fabulous platform for that particular threat environment, for that particular classic Southeast Asia combat SAR. I for one, I was early in the A-10 and was against the idea of it being a forward air controller. That shows you how stupid I was. It became an excellent platform for a forward air controller. And for those of us who have the Sandy experience, you know, you need that on-scene commander capability to stay there and communicate with your SAR task force, your SARTF, as we call it. And the A-10 would have been, I think, fabulous for that. Today, as Darrell alluded to in his book, which good job on your book, by the way, Darrell. It's just a whole different scenario today. It's all about, that depends on the situation as to what platform will be the best and how are we going to do a SAR. But having a couple thousand hours in the A-10, I sure wish that I could be a Sandy pilot with someone like Jerry Shipman that I heard about all the time when I was a helicopter guy. I wish I could be escorting him in to pick up a survivor. Hope that answers the question.
Yeah, during the 80s, the A-10 community, all the squadrons had a number of pilots designated to be Sandy guys, and I might point out now, we had an A-10 pilot receive an Air Force Cross for a rescue that he conducted in Desert Storm. We had 2 rescues during the Serbian operations. The A-10s were active in both of those. And we also had some pretty amazing things that A-10 Bubba's did, rescuing special forces operations in OIF and then later on in OEF. So what is really key here, you have to remember, you know, as good as our airplanes are, that airplane driver, that crew, if it's a crewed airplane, that's really the weapon, okay? And one of the things that we really did, and I thought this was really smart, coming out of Southeast Asia, we captured so much tactical knowledge. And I'll give you one classic example. So many of the guys, when they came back out of their A1s and their OV-10s and O2s and even F-100s, there weren't tactical jobs immediately available for them, but they banked all those guys. They kept their names and phone numbers and everything. And when we started building the A-10 community, we brought those guys up, and they are the ones who climbed into the first generation of A-10 Bubbas, and they brought all of that tactical knowledge with them, and they built that right into the A-10 community. They created what they called the bag of tricks that we all learned. And it got to the point where the A-10 could do whatever mission that you wanted it to do. It could do some better than others, okay? But the pilots were smart enough that they knew that if you needed a presence mission today, if you need an interdiction mission today, if you need a close air support mission today, it's just a matter of that A-10 pilot reaching into that bag of tricks, pulling out those tactics and applying them on that mission on that day in that machine. So that's a long answer to a short question.
Darrel, one quick note, Darrel, Pepe here is that Paul Jones, guy when the Air Force crossed in the A-10 and Desert Storm, after the war, his first debrief was that he had no Sandy training at weapons school. I was instructor at WIC back then, and he graduated December, right before Storm started. But when he was in a black hole talking to us, that was his first CSAR mission he ever flew or practice was during combat. And when he got back to after the war, the weapons school right away added Sandy training right back into the syllabus for the weapons school based on that. So because once again, the CAF did a lot of stuff, but that kind of fell off the plate at WIC for the A-10 guys. But after that, it was a full up part of the curriculum, thanks to his bravery there in Desert Storm. Just a quick anecdote there.
Are you trying to tell us that we can actually learn our lessons and apply them forward?
We forget them, then we reapply them.
There you go.
Darrel, it's Ron Smith.
Ron, okay.
Roger Youngblood and I wrote the first A-10 SAR tactics manual at Myrtle Beach in 1977, using our experiences from the A-1. And what you guys were saying is exactly right. The A-10 was an outstanding platform for the SAR mission. We could actually go faster than an A-1, which most people don't think about speed in an A-10. But nevertheless, a lot of the tactics were exactly the same. The Air Force obviously never really wanted the A-10. And so we were able to write that tactics manual without any interference from TAC. And it took a while for anybody else to decide to do anything different. But it was many of the lessons that we learned in flying the A-1 in the Sandy role.
Ron is one of my heroes. When I was up there flying his FAC mission, he was one of the Sandy guys in the first SOS over there with Jim Harding and that whole band of thieves over there. And I was just a young nugget guy at the time, and I can remember many a night at NKP when there'd be a big rescue going on, and there'd be a cluster of guys either in the nail hole or on the Sandy hooch, and they'd be developing their bar napkin tactics, man, for what they were going to do the next day and go in and rescue these folks. And it was amazing to watch because I knew, just from listening to all this, I'm just a young lieutenant. I'm soaking all this type stuff up, right? But these guys would leave with plan A, and they'd be a plan X-ray by the time they finally got the guy out, because they would get in there, this would change, that would change, they would adapt, they would overcome, they would improvise, and they'd get a successful rescue. And that's what makes these missions so incredibly powerful and so incredibly interesting. And it's a real honor to really be here with you guys, because you guys are the real heroes.
Back to you, Mel.
All right, John Reimler, do you want to ask your question?
Johnny Reimler, Great American. And can you give us the question, Mel?
Hey, Darrell, Bill Stramberg, I can read it.
Okay.
He says, has any information been discovered about the Tom Zorn shoot down late in 72? He was a weasel. I think his call sign was Cosmic.
I have no information on that particular mission. No, I recognize the call sign. Certainly, that was a recce bird out of Udorn, but I don't know anything about that particular mission. No, sorry.
And then we have a question from Bill Strandberg as well.
Okay.
Okay. One thing, I noticed the RCCs were located quite a distance apart throughout the theater. How did they communicate? Were they hardwired, landline? Were they HF? Did they do much communication between each other, or did they operate independently when they were working the different rescues in the different areas?
Well, the RCCs were actually considered to be operational locations, and so they had operational authority up there and tasking authority over the various assets that were on alert for them for their region. The JRCC down in Saigon would handle basically any in-country missions about as far north as about the middle of the country. The Da Nang guys, I think their call sign was Queen. They would handle anything in northern South Vietnam and then anything up over the Gulf. And of course, they would coordinate a lot with the Navy. The Navy had a command center out there too. And then over in Thailand, we had, I believe it was Joker. And initially they were at Udorn, and then they moved them to NKP in the summer of 72. And it was the same thing. They would actually handle the cases, the missions that were ongoing. They had authority to scramble and launch. They could task intelligence assets, everything that they needed to run those missions right from there. And then if things got even wilder, then they could coordinate with the JRCC down in Saigon, who was the overall boss, directly working for the 3rd Rescue Group Commander. So that was the command and control structure. And then again, you've got the King HC-130s orbiting. We always had one on orbit over Laos. And anytime we would push a package into North Vietnam, they would launch a Kingbird up into northern Laos too. And then they always had a Kingbird on alert. And anytime a major SAR would kick off, and it was obvious that it wasn't going to be a quick recovery, then they would launch that alert bird too. So we'd have them up there, and they all had Ken Privilege, you jump in here too if you got more data on this. But they all had comms. They used HF a lot, as terrible as that was. But and they had all the tactical radios too. But Ken, you for comments because you flew those missions.
Yeah, well, I learned from all the heroes from those days. I was actually a potential user of this great rescue bunch. So I didn't get into it until I met both Stovall and Jerry at the rescue headquarters. But the HC-130s were in the air constantly, and they were basically they could be a relay as well as an airborne commander, on-scene commander. We usually gave over to the Sandys, but everything was usually relayed through the Kingbirds, and that was basically the product that we carried on with us for a long, long time. They still have modifications of that, but the HC-130 was well equipped with a huge crew. They had radio operators who knew every trick in the book to contact people. And of course the poor co-pilot had a chalkboard on the right side that he was trying to keep track of all the people that were
were in the area. And of course, they were always getting inundated with every one of the fighter pilots in the world. As soon as the call went out, everybody wanted in on the fight. And
Yeah.
I mean, they literally, I think once in a while they would get these calls that coming out of Hilda back at the headquarters would say, "Would you tell all those guys to sit still and let you guys tell them not to get off of their missions because they wanted to basically join in on the fight because there was a guy down."
Roger that.
Yeah. And the now did for the rescue forces, did they get support from T-ball calls as they were up north? I know we talked about the MiG flight coming in. Did they or was that filtered so that you really didn't know it was coming from them but from somebody else?
They were pretty well in on the know of where it was all coming from. They had to be real careful because of putting out different signals and whatever, because whoever was calling, but like I said, you had a navigator, a co-pilot, and a pilot all monitoring all of the radios and coordinating the folks coming in. You had the radio operator talking to anybody and everybody. He probably knew more about who was actually doing the passing the messages than anybody else in the aircraft, quite frankly. Basically the engineer kept the thing in the air and the loadmaster kept the hoses ready, and that was about it. It was they were also of course the air refueling and stuff, and quite frankly, I have found a number of guys over the years. Darrel and I have been in a number of meetings with all of these guys from Stovall, Shipman, and the guys, but we found a number of guys that flew those HCs, and they were mostly upset that they didn't ever get to go north. they were so gung ho. They said it would get so crazy because all the noise in there, and if the helicopters are going there, why can't we go get them? And we did have one fella that did cross the line once and went to try to get a helicopter to refuel him to get him back. So yeah, they were all in on the fight, but it was rather humdrum most of the time sitting up there, but it usually got pretty furball when something went on.
I one quick comment. I sat in on a training session at Offutt with the rivet joint Raven crew, the three guys up front, the officers, and the training was teaching them how to be the initial coordinator for CSAR. The RJ, because of the ability to listen to all the bad guys and also any other comms coming up from somebody that's down, until the arrival of the unseen coordinator, the RCs are the ones that do the initial high altitude coordination to get everybody in. And they track both, of course, the bad guys and pass that information along with keeping track. And these young lieutenants are trained right from the start in the simulator. And at the time, the Iowa Guard would be calling in on a radio telephone link, and they'd have helicopter sounds in the background and everything else to make the training in the simulator as realistic as possible. But that's a point that is quite a bit different than in Vietnam.
Absolutely.
Okay, guys,
This is Dale Stovall. Here's a 130 comment. They did go to North Vietnam. On the first day of Oyster, both the A1s and the Jollies, we overstayed our fuel. And now we're coming out, and my wingman's got a low fuel light. He's not going to get out of North Vietnam. I called the king and I says, we've got this problem. And the king says, I've been monitoring your fuel, Jolly. I'm in North Vietnam right now. He fueled us at 10,000 feet, 50 miles inside of North Vietnam. Think about that.
It doesn't get any better than that, folks.
Dale, this is Jerry. We also got refueled the day you made the pickup for Oyster.
Yeah.
If you recall.
Team sport,
Okay,
folks.
I gotta wrap this up because I have two active duty officers who are on our team right now, and they actually have to go do Air Force stuff tomorrow, as do I. So hate to end it now because we could probably go on for 2 more hours, I'm pretty sure. But I want to thank everybody for, I want Darrel, incredible session. We would have gone 90 minutes exactly. So that's probably a record for us. That's pretty incredible.
Yep.
Probably our best session overall. We want to thank all the authors for this 6-book session series we had, all the way from Linebacker to The Limits of Air Power to The Road Not Taken, to Bears Upside Down, to The Party Girls, and finally this one on the Moral Imperative. A couple of lessons real quick too are that valor was common amongst our airmen throughout the war. From the facts to the CSAR guys, to the fighters and bomber pilots, and also much more to our POWs, who endured so much and came home with great honor when the war ended. Number 2 is that innovation of tactics and technology that emerged there was incredible this war. And if you look at the CSAS of the Air Force, from CSAS 11 to 17, everything in between, all the CSAS had flown in Vietnam. So the Air Force we have today that we built in the 80s, the aggressors, the red flag, all the lessons we learned from Vietnam, we actually put into play back in the 80s. And the success was Desert Storm, Allied Force, and how our guys quickly adapted to the going war of GWAT. So Vietnam veterans, the airmen, you guys built today's Air Force, and tomorrow's Air Force is going to benefit from all the great things you did. So I really wish all the airmen would read these books that we had during this session, because there's so many lessons learned historically about the Air Force and how we grew from the World War II Korea to the force we are today came from the hours and the blood, sweat, and tears from our airmen in Vietnam. So thank you all for that. This is my last book session, so I want to thank my team. Jen Brown, who's actually 9 months pregnant. I hope nothing happens tonight while you're here. Mel Sidwell Bowron, Melissa March, who's a student intel officer doing work right now. TL Tucson, a commander out at Schriever, and then South Gilpin, who's on watching the Joint Staff right now in UO6. They're the ones who helped me build this book club from scratch. We started 3 years ago doing for Air Force Intel. The last 2 years have been incredible. We've learned so much from about the recent and late history of the Air Force that it's just makes you really proud to be an airman. I want to thank the foundation for hosting us, and we wish you nothing but good luck ahead. And so to the team, great job. Darrel, outstanding book. I like all your books. You got to keep on writing, buddy, and tell them more about our history to our young guys. With that, that's a good night from DC, and we'll see everybody else in the green room, but have a good Air Force evening.
Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Darrel, are you headed back to DC area soon?
I'll be there in May for the Air Force Historical Foundation.
Oh, okay. I'll bring my books. I got some to sign.
Okay. Okay, Bill.
We'll see you then.
You guys are my heroes. Take care. Hey, Chris.
Good seeing you, Darrel.
Yeah, I'm just watching as we're signing off here. I didn't realize we had that many people on here tonight and everything. But hey, Chuck, and I really want to thank you a lot on the nomination. Your support there and what you gave me, just really tremendous. God bless you, buddy.
Open.
Okay, here we go.